Good evening, everybody. My name is Briony Wood-Ingram and I'm the Acting Director of the Australian APEC Study Centre at RMIT University, and I'll be your MC for this evening. I'm delighted to welcome you all here for the 2017 Australian APEC Study Centre lecture. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and pay our respects to their elders, both present, past and future. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the inheritors of the oldest continuous cultural traditions in this land and traditional owners and custodians of Australia and its islands since time immemorial. I'd like to welcome our distinguished speakers this evening, the Honourable Stephen Ciobo, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, and Mr Martin Bean, CBE, Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT University. We're also very pleased to extend a particular welcome this evening to the Consul General of India, Ms Manika Jain, the Consul of Malaysia, Ms Nur Hayati Abun Noor, the Consul General of Indonesia, Ms Dewi Savitri Wahab, Consul General Republic of Chile, Mr Gabriel Jara Maldonado, the British Consul General for Melbourne, Mr Christopher Holtby, OBE, the Consul General of the Sultanate of Oman, Dr Ahmad Ali Alawi, the Consul General for the United Arab Emirates, His Excellency Saeed Al Kemsi, the Director of the Victorian State Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ms Jenny Bloomfield, and the Australian representative on the APEC Business Advisory Council, Mr Robert Milliner, and we also have Group Leader and Deputy Director of the Tianjin Municipal Commission of Industry and Information Technology, Mr Gu Yuan Biao, and Group Secretary Deputy General Manager from the Tianjin Rail Transit Group, Mr Huang Qi. To start proceedings for this evening, allow me to introduce our host, Mr Martin Bean, Vice-Chancellor and President of RMIT University. Martin was appointed as Vice-Chancellor at RMIT in January 2015. He previously held positions as Vice-Chancellor of the Open University, the UK's largest academic institution, and a global leader in the provision of flexible learning, General Manager of Microsoft's Worldwide Education Products Group, and various executive leadership roles at Novell and other companies integrating technologies and learning systems. Please, Martin, come to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Briony, and welcome everybody. It's fantastic to have you here, particularly to all of our distinguished guests here this evening. A very, very warm welcome. At Wominjeka, everybody. So I'm Martin Bean, as you've heard, the very, very proud Vice-Chancellor and President here at RMIT, and I'd like to give a very special welcome to RMIT, to Minister Ciobo, on this very chilly Melbourne night. We froze him in Geelong today, so for the Victorians that are here, we took him to the chilly coastline, so we're warming him up here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. But what a pleasure to have you, and we're all so looking forward to your remarks. We're absolutely honoured and delighted that you can be here, and again, to all of our distinguished guests, many of whom are no strangers to RMIT. It's wonderful to have you back in the audience. It's always nice. It's like welcoming you into our home. So welcome back, everybody. And I'd like to pay a particular welcome to the members of our Tianjin Leadership Group who are with us here this evening, that we have the great good fortune of hosting every year in the bilateral city-to-city relationship between Melbourne and Tianjin. It's lovely to see you, my friends. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we have our meeting this evening, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I'd like to also share with Briony in saying on behalf of the university and myself to just acknowledge and recognise their elders past, present and future. Shortly we'll be hearing from the Minister on the challenges facing Australia as a trading nation. And higher education for Australia is a very key part of that story, and I believe increasingly it's going to be part of the solution for Australia and our partners throughout the world. Education is the #1 export industry in Victoria and the third strongest in Australia, earning the country almost $22 billion in the year 2016-17. We're part of a huge industry, but of course education is first and foremost about people. And for all of our friends and colleagues from around the world, I want you to know that my institution is very much aware of the fact that education is not an extractive industry. It's a partnership to grow a shared vision of prosperity between our nations for the future. It's about educating our students to succeed in life and work in Australia and all around the world. And at RMIT, that's what I'd like to think we're doing day in and day out. And by sort of Victorian standards, since colonisation, we're 130 years old. So we've been doing it for quite some time in the history of Australia. And our founding motto, which I really love from 130 years ago, is a skilled hand and a cultivated mind. And if you think about education around the world, I was chatting with my colleague from India, and that's a nation that deeply understands that its future lies in skilled hands as well as cultivated minds. Just as many of the representatives from different nations represented in the room understand as well. And that's why being the president of a university like RMIT that fully embraces its role in the skill agenda as well as the higher education agenda makes us a very contemporary university despite our age. However, things are not as simple as they once were. The world is going through a period of disruption that is arguably the greatest since the Industrial Revolution. Industry that just a few years ago seemed strong and permanent are being shaken by the rise of the digital economy. I mean, you don't need to look further than newspapers, free-to-air TV, taxis, hotel chains, and these are just some of the sectors that are reinventing themselves. And I think it's important that we focus on reinvention. The rise of robotics and automation is affecting the nature and number of jobs in mining and manufacturing, transport, and even service industries. But it's not just about the jobs that are going away or being disrupted. As the Minister and I discussed earlier this evening, the focus needs to shift to the jobs that are being created, the thousands and thousands of jobs that didn't exist before, that together, if we combine the power of our education systems with industry, with the political, economic and social will, actually means that the future is pretty bright. But it is going to take universities to realise that the world is changing around us too. We can no longer simply educate our students for the jobs that exist today. We need to develop them to win jobs that don't yet exist, to adapt and thrive in a world where change is a constant, not just a passing phase. And I'd like to think that we're rising to that challenge. I'm incredibly proud of how our staff and students are embracing global opportunities by working hand in hand with industry partners and solving global problems with real-world solutions. But you know what gives me the greatest optimism of all? Vice-Chancellors, we have the best jobs in the world. If ever a Vice-Chancellor complains to you about their job, tell them to resign and get another one, because our jobs are brilliant. Because whenever I feel jaded or despondent about the world, all I need to do is to get out of my office and wander around my campus and talk to my students. Because I'm left with a profound understanding that they're smarter than I was at their age. They're more committed than I was at their age. They understand that the baby boomers stole all the wealth from them, and yet they've inherited all the problems. And they don't spend a lot of time complaining about it. They realise that's their lot in life, and they are going to work their way through it. And just give you a couple of examples. Our Vic Hyper team were the only students to represent the Southern Hemisphere in Elon Musk's SpaceX competition in the United States, aiming to revolutionise the future of long-distance ground transportation. In France recently, our students came second in the world in the 2017 Airbus Fly Your Ideas competition, looking to answer one of the 5 challenges identified by Airbus to provide sustainable future solutions for the aviation industry. And they're just 2 examples in the last 12 months of what this remarkable generation is capable of if we have the will to create an enabling environment for them to succeed. And it's these types of experiences, when I talk to our students, that shape them and get them ready for life and work. And that's the future of education, and it's the future, I'm proud to say, that together we can bring to life for them. I'd like to thank Alan very, very much, Alan Oxley, and the staff of the Australian APEC Study Centre. One of the jewels in the crown of this institution, and we are just so lucky with the support of government that we have the ability to host the APEC Study Centre here at RMIT. And I want to thank everybody for the Centre for organising this amazing annual lecture this evening. And Minister, I'm sure like everybody else in the room, I'm looking forward with anticipation to hearing your thoughts on the way ahead. I'm proud to say the microphone is yours. You're taller than I am, so you'll probably need to stick it back up again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for your warm words of welcome, particularly needed for a Queenslander, and I appreciate the chance to come along this evening. Can I also acknowledge Alan Oxley? Alan is Chairman of the APEC Study Centre, those Business Advisory Council members that are here this evening, and of course Your Excellencies and numerous members, Consuls General that are here this evening representing the Diplomatic Corps. Other distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a pleasure to be here in Melbourne at Australia's APEC Study Centre. In just 5 months, I'll join trade ministers from around the world for the 11th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organisation in Buenos Aires. And there is some symbolism, of course, in the organisation that regulates and promotes trade holding its biennial meeting of ministers in Argentina. The meeting of WTO ministers will come on the second anniversary of the fall of the Kirchner government in Argentina. This failed populist experiment that introduced import restrictions, export taxes and currency controls. And that election saw Mauricio Macri, the now president of Argentina, elected on a message that trade is a source of opportunity, not a threat. Now, this seems contrary to the current mood in some quarters. Indeed, words like populism and protectionism are increasingly part of the vernacular. But history is familiar with this mood and the damage it causes. As President Macri's finance minister said last year, and I quote him, "Protectionism and nationalism will not make your economy richer and will not accelerate your growth. It will increase stagnation and poverty," and we've been there. Nevertheless, while one country learns from the mistakes of isolationism, nationalism and protectionism, other countries are considering policies to take them down this very path. The question is why? The only explanation is that some are confusing nationalism and patriotism as kindred principles, and they are not. As patriots, we should want the best standard of living for our fellow citizens. Nationalism can never sustain this objective. The problem is what I will call the populism discovery lag. The Made in Argentina policy of the former Argentine government was popular, and on first blush, why wouldn't it be? A ban on foreign manufactured mobile phones may have seen Apple leave the market, and BlackBerry opened a new manufacturing in southern Argentina where jobs were needed. The then president herself witnessed the first BlackBerry coming off the production line. And what a popular triumph. Argentinians now able to buy mobile phones made by their fellow Argentinians. The problem, however, was the phone was 2 years out of date and twice as expensive as the model produced by BlackBerry's factory in Mexico. And the BlackBerries produced in Argentina were so outdated and expensive that Argentinians stopped buying them. And within 2 years, the factory had closed. So the point of Argentina's experience is that while it may take some time, eventually people realise that nationalism is a hollow promise that leads their standard of living to diminish and not to thrive. And the Argentinian example is not unique to history. The Korean Peninsula is perhaps one of the starkest examples of the benefits of free trade. Since the end of the Korean War in 1953, the South, an open economy, trading with the world, has flourished. South Korea now has the world's 11th largest economy with GDP of nearly $1.8 trillion. Compare that to the North, which is shut off from the world with a GDP estimated at around about $16 billion, where the stories of suffering and starvation we all know are far too familiar. Australia too has had protectionist policies in the past. Trade protectionism and a range of poor economic policies caused Australia to slip from being the third wealthiest country in the world in 1913 to being 15th by 1990. And the history books show that the beggar thy neighbour trade policies that were implemented in the 1930s did much, in fact, to deepen and to prolong the Great Depression. This approach compounded the underlying problem and made everyone worse off as a consequence. So, as parts of the world again flirt with protectionism, the Australian Productivity Commission just yesterday released a report that outlines what rising protectionism may in fact mean for Australia. A self-initiated report of the Commission, it nominated the empowerment of proponents of protectionism in Europe and the election of Donald Trump as motivations for this contemporary assessment. And the Commission found that if tariffs were to rise by 15 percentage points around the world, the ensuing economic dislocation could cause a global recession. For Australia, this would see economic activity reduce by around $12 billion, 5% of our capital stock left idle, and up to 100,000 jobs being put at risk. Incomes, it was estimated, would decline by around $1,500. So it's evident then that we cannot afford a widespread backsliding approach to trade policy that would see us slide back into protectionism. Australia is a trading nation. Our ability as a country of less than 25 million people to sell our goods and services potentially to billions of people around the world is what makes our country rich. The standard of living we experience is among the highest in the world, and in fact second highest in the world according to the United Nations Human Development Index. But for Australian households, the benefits of trade aren't just demonstrated by the experiences of Argentina or by a United Nations index, but these benefits flow straight through to the hip pocket. Trade liberalisation has lifted the income of Australian households by around about $4,500 a year. And of course, for the 1 in 5 Australian jobs that are now trade-related, the importance of open markets means even more to their household budget. International trade has also made the cost of production in Australia cheaper. Nearly 2/3 of our imports are capital and intermediate goods, which are used as inputs in our own industries. While in New York in January, I made the point that running a trade deficit or a trade surplus with any one country should not be seen as a proxy of the success or a measure of the success or otherwise of the trading relationship between those countries. Indeed, Australia has a trade deficit with the United States. But the purchase of Boeing aircraft by Qantas and Virgin Australia supports our tourism industry. It's our largest services export industry. And similarly, the purchase of Caterpillar heavy machinery from the United States supports, of course, our iron and coal exports. So we may have a trade deficit with the United States, but our imports from the United States drive exports, and indeed trade surpluses with other nations, notably China, Korea and Japan. So trade is a major component of how Australia has achieved 26 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And this is a remarkable feat, given that this period spans the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s, and more recently, the global financial crisis. Now, Australia's annual GDP grew by 2.4% last year. Net exports made up more than half of this growth, contributing some 1.4 percentage points. This statistic alone tells how much our economy and our standard of living would be at risk from isolationist policies. Overall, exports grew by 7.9% in 2016, 3 times faster than the rest of the economy. And this growth would not have been possible had Australia not embraced liberalised trade, lowering our own tariffs, opening new markets abroad, strengthening trade rules, welcoming foreign investment, and working toward a seamless business environment across borders have all been critical. Now, true, things would have been a lot tougher for the Australian economy if it were not for the resources boom over the past decade. But after the boom, we didn't bust. And this was in very large measure a result of years of policy reform, which has made the Australian economy more flexible and more adaptable. And to further advance our nation's prosperity, the Turnbull government is pursuing an ambitious trade agenda. We recognise that opening markets and investment opportunities is essential to Australia's future prosperity. Concluding the With a population of over 250 million people right on our doorstep, this agreement will herald a new era in our economic relationship with Indonesia. Australian businesses will benefit not only from increased access to Indonesia's growing market, but also new opportunities to partner with Indonesian businesses to access markets throughout the region. And I'm very pleased that Prime Minister Turnbull and President Widodo recently recommitted to our end of the year timeframe for concluding the negotiations between Indonesia and Australia. We've also recently launched our free trade agreement negotiations with two APEC members, Hong Kong and Peru, and we continue to work towards commencing negotiations with the European Union and the United Kingdom. Last month, I was pleased to launch trade negotiations with the Pacific Alliance, comprised of Mexico, Chile, Peru, all APEC members, as well as Colombia. An FTA with the Pacific Alliance will create new export opportunities for Australian farmers, miners, manufacturers, educators, service providers, and investors in some of Latin America's major economies. Importantly, this agreement would open the door to Mexico for Australian exporters, a very important economy that offers considerable opportunities. The Pacific Alliance is a significant trade bloc with a GDP that's worth more than 1.8 trillion US dollars. And the four countries account for 38% of Latin America's population and roughly 50% of the total imports into Latin America. Pacific Alliance members imported goods and services worth more than 600 billion US dollars in 2016. And Australia's ability to capitalise on this demand is certainly limited at the current point in time by high tariff barriers. Tariffs of up to 80% are imposed on Australian beef, while dairy products attract tariffs of up to 98% and sugar exports face restrictions that prevent trade into Pacific Alliance countries. Australia's services exports, including education and mining services, also face significant competitive barriers. An FTA will bring down these barriers and ensure Australian businesses have competitive access. And the Turnbull government is also pursuing regional trade deals. With the remaining Trans-Pacific Partnership parties, we're exploring what alternative arrangements we may be able to derive from the agreement. And I remain hopeful that agreement on this important issue can be achieved when the TPP 11 ministers meet in Da Nang in November in the margins of the APEC Leaders Summit. As for the other regional potential mega deals, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, negotiations continue to move forward and are currently focusing on the critically important market access element. And we're also seeking ways to make the most of our economic relationship with India. These ambitions, of course, come on the back of results. Since 2013, the Coalition has concluded new free trade agreements with China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and many of the Pacific Island nations through the PACER Plus agreement. And these agreements are all collectively yielding results for the Australian economy, and particularly, of course, for Australian exporters. I use the example of Gapsteed Wines in Victoria's beautiful high country, an award-winning winery producing premium cool climate wines. It has seen sales to China go from a couple of hundred cases a year 2 years ago to now over 10,000 cases this year. And this is in part due to growing demand, but also because of the privileged market access conditions that we achieved under the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, specifically through tariff reductions. And the story is a common one across the wine industry. In 2016, Australia's bottled wine exports to China grew by some 37.8%, reaching a total of $470 million, as Chapter cut the tariff that they faced from 14% to 8.4%. That tariff today now sits at 5.6% and will be completely eliminated by the 1st of January 2019. This gives Australian exporters an advantage over our competitors from Europe and the United States, who are still, of course, subject to the 14% tariff. There are many similar stories of how our free trade agreements are giving Australian companies new opportunities for growth in goods and services trade and in investment. And with the Asia-Pacific region at the very heart of Australia's future prosperity, APEC will play a key role in carrying the torch for free and open markets. In the face of protectionist sentiment, It's critical that APEC economies maintain the forum's long-standing commitment to free trade. And at the recent meeting of APEC ministers responsible for trade in Hanoi in May, I pressed the importance of APEC remaining committed to trade and investment liberalisation and supportive of the rules-based multilateral trading system. Now, whilst this is not reflected in a consensus communique, I applaud Vietnam's chair's statement, which reaffirmed our pledge against protectionism. An encouraging outcome of the Hanoi meeting was renewed support for the APEC Services Competitiveness Roadmap, agreed to by leaders in 2016. Now, this is, of course, a crucial step towards addressing barriers that inhibit our services businesses engaging in APEC markets. Enhanced market access for services is central to driving growth across the APEC region. And this is especially the case for Australia, where services represent around 75% of our economy and employ roughly 4 out of 5 Australians. Services currently account for almost a quarter of Australia's total exports. But overall, our services sector is primarily oriented towards domestic consumers and producers, with only a relatively small portion of our services output actually being exported. As such, you can see that there is tremendous opportunity and upside for Australian services businesses. The services trade has enormous potential to fuel our future growth. If we can boost the competitiveness and international orientation of the sector, as well as achieve meaningful liberalisation. And to help the roadmap succeed, Australia has made a $2 million commitment to fund practical capacity building projects that will enable developing APEC economies to overcome barriers to implementing the roadmap in their own economies. Australia's assistance will help to build capacity of APEC regulators, micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, as well as other institutions, to understand and to provide action to the commitments under the roadmap. Here at home, we're not waiting for APEC to drive progress. As we committed to do at the last election, the Turnbull government has established a professional services mutual recognition unit within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And this unit provides support to our professional associations and to regulators to address behind-the-border barriers and to negotiate the recognition of Australian qualifications and licensing in partner economies. This initiative will make a practical difference to the access enjoyed by Australian services exporters. So, ladies and gentlemen, your outreach to the business, academic and policy communities is certainly a very valuable asset to our advocacy agenda. This centre's support for Australia's participation in APEC and its advocacy of APEC's objectives has helped us to make the most of the forum. The Turnbull government will continue to make the case for economic openness and continue to seek ambitious trade liberalisation outcomes. And we know that this is critical, that we must undertake this to continue Australia's enviable standard of living. So with those few remarks, I thank you very much for the opportunity, Martin, and to you, Alan, to speak with you this evening. And Australia and I certainly look and remain committed to making sure that Australia remains a beacon for the benefits of free trade and a clearer indication of our ongoing policy commitment to trade liberalisation. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I'd now like to welcome Mr Alan Oxley, Chairman of the Australian APEC Studies Centre at RMIT University, who will offer some concluding remarks and facilitate a Q&A session with Minister Ciobo. Thank you, Alan. If you want to stay there, Minister, to answer questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Minister. We've heard a lot of gloom about trade in the last 6 months, a year, and congratulate you for drawing to people's attention the very significant achievements we have achieved in trade policy in Australia. We are world leaders, and indeed your own work. I was quite pleased as well, may I say, that you've raised the issue of services, because one of the hardest issues to explain to people, but in fact the new agreements, as you'd be very well aware, in the Asian region, which we've had a major hand in negotiating, are drawing to the attention of developing countries they need to open their services markets. To give you an example, in Australia and the industrialised countries, about 80% of GDP is generated by services. In developing countries like Indonesia, it's 40 to 60%. Unless the countries in the region open their services sector, they're not going to get the growth that they need. So in one sense, therefore, you are in a position where we are leading the region to try and have it see where it needs to go. Now, of course, we've had some hiccups. And of course, Trump has led to many questions, and even Brexit now being described as protectionist. In my opinion, it's not. And I've been invited to join a group with some other former trade officials from around the world to work with an institute in London which is connected to the Conservative Party to help the British understand what Brexit means. The UK has no trade officials. All the British trade officials who are working in Brussels stayed there. Obviously, the allowance was too good and the tax concessions were fine. So the British government is now having to rebuild its trade ministry. And it's doing so. It's actually hired a New Zealander, somebody I know very well, who's a very, very good official, to try and lead in all that training. So, Minister, it's gratifying, and well, I haven't touched on Trump, but one thing I will say in this whole debate is that there's been an inclination to actually overlook what the structure of legal rules is in the world economy. In fact, there is very little black-letter international law. The WTO is one of the few institutions which actually has this. And as Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, discovered to his dismay, that the United States is bound to the rules of the WTO and how it trades, as are all other countries. They can't be changed in a hurry. And Trump is not going to be able to take action to change this unless he does something quite dramatic. And the facts are that the mood of the leaders in the Congress is not to move in this direction with him. And I think what we'll see is Trump will start to moderate in some areas. We're starting to see that a little bit with the NAFTA. For all that, though, he has cast a blanket across the debate. He's made protectionism fashionable, and it is, in fact, affecting how we are addressing things today. Now, my task is to invite questions for the Minister. So who's got something to put to the Minister?
Okay. Hi, I'm Alberto Poza from RMIT. Thank you, Minister, for such an interesting and really to the point talk about international trade and its benefits. You mentioned the Argentinian story, and as you correctly mentioned, this has been, I'm actually from Ecuador, and we've seen this wave across Latin America, and at times it feels it's like watching a car crash in slow motion, because you sort of know what's going to happen, and then you sort of realize that it's happening, unfolding in front of your eyes. And I think Venezuela has become sort of the poster boy for why these things don't work. In understanding trade, however, and some of the backlash that we're now seeing against it, I think it's important to remember that in Argentina, as well as in much of Latin America, after trade liberalization, inequality increased. And as you rightly mentioned, there are benefits to trade. But what Latin America experienced was mainly that these benefits weren't accruing to everyone in society in an equal way. And in this way, I think we need to marry trade liberalization policies with policies that focus on redistribution of these benefits, particularly, as Martin mentioned, through targeted education that really, really helps gear the next generation toward addressing these issues. Latin America has a lot of problems with the educational sector, of course, but starting from that base, I think will be helpful. And on the other hand, of course, trying to marry this to policies that help explain the benefits of globalization and trade to the wider public. It's amazing to see that if you go out into the street today and you ask people, is smoking good for you or bad? Most people are likely to say, no, smoking is pretty bad. Voting in a populist government is the same as smoking for a country. It's smoking a pack a day, you know what I mean? And we need to keep that in mind as well. And I wonder, as a policymaker, how would you go around, say, pushing for those ideas, a better understanding of globalization, but also thinking about redistribution and helping those that are being unfortunately left behind. Thank you.
Great statements and great question. I mean, you've raised a number of different points in the context of that. Look, as is evident by my comments this evening, I think personally the best way that I can be an advocate, a strong advocate around the benefits of trade liberalisation is to highlight the different case studies, to talk about the cameos, and indeed I try to do that on a regular basis in Parliament. It's not the be-all and end-all of advocacy, but it is all that I can do in terms of engaging in a material way to provide a contrast with what is the regular occurrence that you might get on the front page of a newspaper which says, this factory is closing down, or, I went to Geelong today. And people equate that with the downside, the negatives of exposure to global trade. I think taking the opportunity to highlight the benefits that flow, to speak about the experience of Swiss or Blackmores, or to talk about wine exports, or any of those types of examples are all absolutely critical to bringing balance back into the discussion that's to be had. When the Vice-Chancellor and I were speaking a little earlier tonight, I spoke about the importance of advocacy, because advocacy is critical. In fact, it's never been more critical than it is now. And when you see examples that you picked up with respect to Latin America toying with protectionism, and it's almost like a ex coming back and thinking, will this relationship be different the second time? I think just being reminded of the shortcomings and the ability to highlight the benefits that do flow. Part of the issue in Australia, and that's again why I made reference to the fact that on the United Nations Human Development Index we're number 2 in the world, that we have such a high per capita standard of living, that we have enjoyed 26 years of continuous economic growth, is a consequence of, among other things, but in large measure, a consequence of our commitment to trade liberalisation. So that's part of the political challenge that I've got. You also raised the really critical issue about equality. And I, from time to time, see commentators in Australia make reference to Australia's experience, in some way paralleling it with the US experience. But if you look, for example, over the last 20 years, the average median wage in the United States has grown by, I think over that period, I'm going off memory here, I'm looking at Angus, he's holding up 4 fingers, has grown by 4%. Australia's has grown by roughly 50%. The experience in this country is radically different to the experience in the United States. Now, has our trade experiment been radically different? Probably not. That notwithstanding, though, it's a whole range of domestic policies that have directly impacted upon the extent to which the general population has enjoyed the benefits of, let's call it the positive externalities of trade. In fact, the real dividends that flow from trade. So I think that is critical and fundamental to how you bolt on those suite of domestic policies to produce the kinds of equality that people are looking for that give you a more egalitarian society.
Someone up the back who's got the microphone.
Yeah, sure. I'm Christopher Zagouris, Professor of International Studies here at RMIT, but also President of the International Education Association of Australia. And I agree absolutely with your remarks about protection and trade protectionism, Minister, and we really support the approach you're taking. But I think a more pressing concern in Australia and in many countries is an anti-immigration sentiment, which often goes is part and parcel with that populism. And in Australia, while there's bipartisan support for a liberal trading markets, a trading regime, the support for a free flow of people is much more precarious, I think. And if you think about the services industries and education in particular, we've benefited hugely from Australia's much more open stance compared with the UK, United States and our competitors. And in international education, our ability to recruit academic staff and teachers, but also to have very generous conditions for students to be able to work part-time, post-study work rights and so on, has really attracted a lot of people, both teachers and students, to our country. Are you concerned about the populist anti-immigration sentiment rising in Australia as it has elsewhere? Because I think that's, in some ways, that happens before restrictions on trade do, and I think we're quite vulnerable to that.
Absolutely, I am. Absolutely, I am. You see sometimes the marriage is probably too strong a word, but you see from time to time that there's a correlation between the push that comes from those, for example, in the labour movement and trade union movement, who, let's be frank, have been at the very front end of this anti-immigration push that we've seen. And I think there's perhaps no starker example than what I consider, and I, at the time, was very critical of what I considered an absolutely disgusting campaign around the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. We saw something like a $25 million public spending campaign by Australia's unions to basically imply that every Chinese electrician would be able to come to Australia devoid of any real-world experience, devoid of any qualifications, and be able to wire up your home and cause deaths. And that was at the core, as ugly as it was, that was at the core of what was obviously a very xenophobic campaign at the time. Now, there are implications that flow from that. And the implications vary depending on who you're speaking with and who's in government at any point in time. Now, recently, obviously, the government that I'm a member of took decisions with respect to reforms around our 457 visa process. I know that some would say that's gone too far, others say it hasn't gone far enough. But that is in response to community concern, however well-founded or otherwise, that necessitated a government response to community angst. Now, I would say in an ideal world, you wouldn't have the kind of union campaign that was funded to the tune of $25 million that you did. And the challenge and frustration for me is I don't have $25 million that I can spend on a community campaign. In contrast to that, I mean, I do, but I suspect I wouldn't survive Senate estimates if I did it. But the importance of explaining, and again, providing concrete examples to everyday Australians that far from taking an Australian's job, which is of course the populist refrain that you hear, this is actually driving our nation's GDP, boosting aggregate demand, and putting our entire country in a much stronger position, which of course will cascade down in benefits as well through greater provision of government services. So, yes, I'm concerned about it, but all we can do is maintain vigilance.
Can the microphone be passed out, please?
Sorry, I've got a microphone here. Can I ask a question? My name is Laura Matiazzi. I'm from NAB. Minister, I really want to ask you a question about the balance between, when it comes to free trade, the balance between the transaction approach versus the relationship approach. Why I was saying that is 20 years ago, I was here with RMIT. RMIT brought me over from China to study. I was back then in the whole class, was 50 people. I'm probably one of the few Chinese students back then. And last week, I presented to a group of high school girls from Lauriston, the old Chinese girl. They want to know what Australia is about, how they're going to get best back out of their education investment. Where I'm coming from is free trade. I was in NAB the last 4 years. I was in agriculture, so you could imagine what the best time I've ever had in my life. And that's pretty much since the free trade agreement was put in place with China. And the benefiting of that, in particular, the high country client that you mentioned about wine export, growing from 1,000 cases, 10,000 cases, not only because they benefited from the relationship that the government to government, but also he benefited from the personal and business relationship he forged with a Chinese counterpart. So this is where I'm coming from. With the free trade agreement, we can say we signed up India, we signed up Indonesia, and that's all tick. It's fairly transactional. And what underpins that is the government to government relationship. But deep down, for business, for trade to happen, it's got to be personal and business relationship. And you look at the RMIT, over the years, overseas students back 20 years ago was hardly any from China. Now, 300,000 overseas students here every year, and half they're from China. Have we done ourselves a justice to making sure that export from, say, education perspective, just can go beyond that transactional approach? We're not only just growing in terms of trade and export volume and value, but also we're growing the most important intangible asset that we have here is the human capital. And I do see that's a part of the free trade. I'd love your thoughts on that, Minister. Thank you.
I'm in furious agreement with you. One of the benefits of having it as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is that Julie as Foreign Minister and myself as Trade Minister align our strategic interests, our trade interests, because there actually is not a huge separation between the two. From time to time there's friction. From time to time there are challenges with respect to a trade agenda versus a what's called a foreign affairs agenda. We see evidence of that, just speaking frankly, the South China Sea, where there are those who propose a much more hawkish stance on issues around sovereignty, and I think about people like Greg Sheridan, who I think tend to demonise China. And then there's others who say, well, look, this is our principal trading relationship, it's worth $155 billion a year. For me, the approach is to recognise that both flow. There used to be the saying that good policy makes good politics. Now, that's questioned increasingly these days. But I like to use, I guess, a branch of that school of thought to think that good trade relations make good relations as well, and vice versa. So that really is the underlying approach. I mean, Julie and I regularly speak, the Cabinet regularly considers, indeed we've got the new white paper that's coming out from the DFAT, which will embrace both the relationship side, to use your words, and the trade side. So the two are almost in lockstep.
Can the microphone be passed?
Yeah.
There's two people. Yep.
Thank you, Minister. I'm Dini Seiko from Chinese University of Hong Kong. I'd like to ask a question on the possible negotiations of the free trade agreement with Europe. We know that one of the most important innovations of these new generations of free trade agreements that the EU is negotiating is the Multilateral Investment Court. I'd like to know which are your thoughts as Minister of Trade and Investments of Australia towards this proposal of the European Union. Thank you.
I'm happy to consider it. I mean, the Europeans have raised it with me, and I've indicated a willingness to have a closer look at it as we enter into negotiations. I'm not, as a matter of, I'm not predisposed against it. There are questions that I have in terms of the need for a body to be in permanent existence, albeit it may only be called upon from time to time. Fundamentally, I'm very committed to ISDS. Now, the model that looks like is something that I think we can work through, but I, not for one moment, get caught up in what I think is, frankly, poor emotion around ISDS when I see arguments that are put forward which would jeopardise Australian investments abroad to satisfy, at the very best, some kind of spurious populist argument that, we're going to be able to, we're going to constrain our ability to form public policy because we'll be sued by foreign multinationals. I think that kind of language is absurd, and I think it does us no good at all. And fundamentally, the lived experience demonstrates the success that ISDS has had in protecting Australian investments abroad over being able to be used inappropriately by foreign interests. Now, that's not to say it's perfect. There are examples of forum shopping which we need to deal with, and each time we have an FTA negotiation, it gives us opportunity to look at, one, do we need an ISDS? For example, with the UK, I can't imagine why we would need one, but I'm not going to take it off the table, but I can't immediately think of a reason why we need an ISDS, but for other jurisdictions it would be a different outcome. So we look at all these things. I'm pretty pragmatic about it, and likewise I've indicated to the Europeans I'm happy to look at it.
Last question, Jeff. Can you pass the microphone to the guy in front, please? Thanks.
Minister, I'm Chris Holtby. I'm the British consul here. Thank you for your kind words about looking forward to a British FTA. Frankly, I think what we will be able to achieve together is probably going to set a new model for international free trade agreements. But I actually wanted to ask you a question about digital. because increasingly we're moving into a digital world that is unconstrained by borders. How do you think Australia can lead through that? If the answer is through what the universities do, I think that's part of the answer. But I'd be very interested to know what you think and how you can drive the international community forwards. Thank you.
I certainly see a dedicated opportunity, well, I should say I certainly see an opportunity for a dedicated chapter around digital economy. Now, that's my starting point. It doesn't mean it will actually materialise in every agreement, and I'm going to speak more broadly than just the Australia-UK agreement. TPP, obviously, that agreement of itself was a point of reference around digital economy. The phrase that I use, the pragmatic shorthand, is to say that was a digital agreement in an otherwise analogue world when it comes to trade. There are elements there that I think we can use. Obviously, the Americans are particularly aggressive in terms of their IP interests. But having said that, my personal approach, and I stress my personal approach, not necessarily that of the government, is to recognise that IP absolutely has a right and needs to be protected in a digital world, and as much as possible ensure that IP rights provide the dividends that people expect. So I do think that there's a big role for that. Increasingly we'll see challenges as we do across the full spectrum of policy, whether it's taxation policy, whether it's around dispute settlement, whether it's with respect to things like trade agreements. The digital economy is presenting a full suite of new challenges. We've got to embrace it, we've got to develop pathways forward. They'll be imperfect, but we'll keep refining them, and over time I'm sure that we'll end up with a much better formula that we apply in our FTA negotiations.
Well, Minister, thank you very much indeed. It's been very enlightening. I hope the group's enjoyed it because it's been extremely informative, and I realise that the department's engaged in activity to try and get a wider understanding of the importance of these matters in the community, so I wish you the best of luck. Brioni's told me that unless we clear the room at 7, there'll be chaos, so I invite her to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, this brings to an end this evening's formalities. I'd like to acknowledge and thank our speakers this evening, the Honourable Stephen Ciobo, Martin Bean and Alan Oxley. I'd also like to thank again our distinguished guests, including from the Consular Corps, including Mohammed Fakhri from the Consul General of Egypt. Sorry, I muted you earlier. I would like to now conclude this evening's proceedings. We have canapes and drinks in the foyer, and we'd like to invite you all to join us for some networking time, and I hope you all have a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.